Hi all, Mads Barnkop from Kaizer Electronics. Today it is Thursday the 26th of March. This is day 15 in isolation and not much new to report. Numbers are rising a bit. But today we are talking about electrolytic capacitors. So let's take a look at that.
While film capacitors are getting more and more popular in power electronics, the good old electrolytic capacitors is something we still see in almost every application, simply because they are dirt cheap. Now these came out from some UPS inverters, most likely 6,000 microfarads, comes with some obscure product codes. Then here are some no, that's actually not even electrolytic capacitors, that's MKV. That's a type of film capacitor, so that's a predecessor to the modern MKP capacitors, and a step between the high voltage electrolytic capacitors or oil-filled paper film capacitors. And then you have something like this. You can see it's from 85. Now here's some idle current, 2200 microfarads at 500 volt DC. Now this is very light, so that's a pretty bad sign when it comes to the current rating of a electrolytic capacitor. That an easy way to see if it can conduct a lot of current is to check the connections. If they are big, they are made to conduct a lot of current, and the weight of it. Because if we move down to these arrow walks, but these are also 74,000 microfarads at 40 volt DC, so that's a whole other current they are made for. Some more frequency inverter capacitors here. Chemet 1100 microfarads, 550 volt DC from 2007. And the problem with many of these electrolytic capacitors and their shelf life is that they will need to be reformed once I decide to use them again. And reforming a capacitor, or reforming a electrolytic capacitor, is done by slowly giving it a voltage up to its rated spec, and then you have to measure the leakage current, because if the leakage current is too high, well, the capacitor is busted and you might as well just throw it out. So I guess that's it for this box, but I can see there's also a lot of film capacitors that I forgot to show in my film capacitor video, so why don't we just check those out as well. A nice big aluminum encased 180 microfarads, 700 volt DC. Some good, nice big iCar, 250 microfarads at 300 volt DC. And here's I'm actually kind of sad I missed this one, because this is a noise suppression feed-through capacitor. See, get it to focus here. Pretty bad light for showing a circular object here. 48 volt DC at 250 amp. That's some pretty sturdy feed-through capacitors. Comes from some telephone equipment. Another drawer of capacitors. I sure have a lot of them, it seems. Reefer 1000 microfarads, 350 volt. Again, more of these UPS system bulk capacitors. Must have taken apart a lot of UPS systems, it seems. Again, MKV capacitors. I do have more of them than I expected. Good old Reefer, 3700 microfarads, 450 volt DC. Now these plastic packages are usually used in frequency inverter drives, where they sit mounted through the heatsink, and you have some air cooling around the package itself here. Now this is not an electrolytic capacitor either. This is one of those oil and film capacitors. You can see it's 20 microfarad, 500 volt peak at 10 kilohertz. This actually comes out of an old X-ray system as well. Let's see what this big one is. 2 times 1.1 microfarad, 2500 volts. Seems like I wrote something on a piece of paper here. Forward, thrust common, not sure what that is. Actually says here that it contains PCB. I'm not quite sure where this comes from, but maybe a microwave oven? Not quite sure. But all kinds of smaller electrolytic capacitors. Comes from all kinds of inverters, drives that I took apart. Also have some pretty high current, low voltage DC, 40 volt DC. 63 volt DC, nice and big capacitors. Some good weight in this as well. And what is this big one down here? Another high voltage capacitor, 1 microfarad. And then a good big one here. At least it's shorted, that's good. Maxwell, 30 microfarad at 6 kilovolt. Not quite sure if this is a film capacitor or electrolytic, but it comes from a defibrillator. That's all I know. The last box of electrolytic capacitors I have some of the nice big Siemens 6000 microfarads, 350 volt DC. These actually comes from train traction inverters, but as you can see, not that much current rating for these, the small terminals here. Now the interesting banks here, they have a pretty nice story. And see, it's Siemens capacitors, all mounted. These are 1150 microfarads at 360 volt DC. They sit in, let's see, what's that? Parallel. And I do not remember if it's all of them that just sits in parallel. Yeah, that's just all parallel. So this is a good big bank of 18 of these in parallel. So you can just 18 times that's a good 20,000 microfarad at 360 volt. But as you can see, it has these clamps at the end. And if I take the silver one here, these all came from the same unit. But these actually says Photo Blitz Elco. So these are actually photoflash electrolytic capacitors, which mean they are a special kind that are made to be short-circuited into a xenon lamp. So they are withstandable to some higher reversal voltage, but also peak currents. And these actually came from a X-ray system. That these were mounted by these clamps into a huge bus bar system, and it would charge this entire crate of capacitors up to full charge, then discharge it through the X-ray head to generate the high voltage needed for taking X-ray pictures. Quite an old X-ray unit that I found this in, but very interesting, and I think I will do some pulse application with these banks. Another thing worth noticing here is how it can self-correct after an error. That the small indents in the PCB track, that once you have a capacitor that shorts out because of the hard abuse this is subjected for, it will simply just burn over the track and the unit will keep on working. That is a pretty neat design trick. Now the big cans here are unfortunately again MKV capacitors, so not really a part of this video, but now they're here, we might as well check them out. 10 microfarad at 400 volt DC, and this was 400 volt DC 100 microfarads, and it is quite heavy. So these have been surpassed by new film capacitors by far, whereas the density or charge energy density of electrolytic capacitors are not yet beaten by the film capacitors. If you need a lot of bulk capacitance, electrolytic capacitors are still the way to go. So until next time, see ya.